his computer. We're ready. That means go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Um, and I actually want to apologize to everyone that I sent the invite to and told them it was 5 o'clock. I thought it was 5 o'clock too. I was diligently signed in and wondering if I had the wrong day. So thanks for hanging in there. I'm going to share my screen and start the PowerPoint in a second, with my usual caveat that I've dedicated my entire life to studying ancient technology. The new stuff I really suck at. And so if anything happens and you lose video or you can't hear me, please just come off of mute and say something. This is meant to be kind of interactive. So if you can feel free to take your mute off and ask questions whenever you want. We will do a Q&A at the end, but don't hesitate to chime in at any point. So I'm going to share my screen. And start presentation. There we are. Okay. So I'm wondering, actually, I'm going to poll everybody. How many of you are familiar with the Franklin expedition? I know I'm pretty biased because, you know, it occurred just to the north of me. I'm from Canada. So I grew up listening to the fairy tales and the history about it. But I know south of the border, it's not so well known.
I have read a little about it.
A little?
Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say a lot of us older people know quite a bit about it, I would think, yes.
It was pretty big news in the 80s when they found the first graves. And then again, really big news about 10 years ago when they found the first ship. So the Franklin expedition, led by Sir John Franklin, was an effort by the British Crown to find a sea route through the Arctic archipelago to get to the Orient, which would cut months, actually almost a year, off of the round trip voyage to do trade with Asia, up until they built the Panama Canal. Actually, they would have to go around the Horn of Africa or around the southern tip of South America to get over there. And so the economic implications of finding a Northwest Passage through the Arctic really could not have been understated. As you can see here, these are the ship routes, the traditional ship routes that they took for trade. And they were doing quite a bit of back and forth and trade to the northeastern parts of North America, but hadn't really been able to get too far into the archipelago and truly explore that. And that was one of the big hopes of the Crown, was to learn more about this uncharted area.
Sandra, can I interrupt for a minute and say, if you're on slide 2, I still see slide 1.
Okay. So you have the introduction slide?
I have, yes, I have your first slide, but I don't.
And it didn't just change?
No.
No,
Change for anybody else?
no, mine's the same way. It just says the Lost Franklin expedition.
That's all mine says.
Well, I wonder if it's lag. Tom or Marcus, can you go and get your dad?
Hey, Sandra, go down to the bottom right of your screen and click that icon on the far right. That's the presentation icon. On the very bottom of the screen, the right icon next to the slider, that'll put you into presentation mode. We should be able to then see your advancing of slides.
I haven't, I don't see, there's the slide advancer, but I mean, it's always been changing slides for me.
Maybe just start over, stop sharing, and then reshare your screen, maybe. Just
yeah.
Yeah, that icon
stop.
to me, by the way, looks like a chalice on the bottom.
Yeah, it's one of those hidden little, it should be much more prominent in PowerPoint, and it's not. But that's just a suggestion, Sandra.
Actually, I saw her and she did hit it, so. Because it highlighted when she said, okay, and it started for her, but it didn't start for us. Over and out.
Okay, can you see it now?
We see you.
Do you see the second slide?
Nothing. We
Don't see
see
it.
nothing.
Okay. Well, let me try and share screen. Screen one. Share. What do you see?
Yeah, now we see your screen. Now advance to the next slide.
PowerPoint program.
Okay, let me start the slideshow.
Yeah.
There you go.
There.
Are you seeing my notes view, or are you
Yay.
actually seeing just the
Yeah,
slides?
seeing your notes.
We can
too.
see your.
Well, that's not supposed to happen either. I did warn you. Display settings.
Try grabbing that line and moving it over.
What do you
There
see
you go,
now?
Sandra.
Works.
That's
Okay.
good. Just the slide. You got
All
it.
right.
Yay.
Yay. Thank you. Yeah, this is actually my first time sharing my screen with Zoom. So here are the trade routes that were traditionally followed. And so you can see going around the Horn of Africa up into the India and Southeast Asia. It's a long way. And of course, not all of North America had really been mapped at this point either. So they wanted to finish mapping the Arctic coastline. And again, the whole impetus was this was economic. They wanted to find a cheaper way to do trade with Asia. So these are the two routes that they expected to be able to pass through, coming around the southern tip of Greenland and up through the islands in the Arctic, kind of skirting around. This is an archipelago. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of islands here. So most of them too small to be seen. So they really weren't sure. Very few of them had been mapped. And it was an exploratory mission. They knew that there was a good chance that they would take longer than they were expected to. So they had a lot of extra provisions with them. To illustrate how desperate they were to find this, previous attempts to map the Northwest Passage started as early as 1576. And they tried again and again, up until even John Ross. You might recognize his name. He's the one that found and named the Ross ice sheet in the Antarctic. He tried, he couldn't get through. And all of these names, Perry, William Edward Perry, George Beck, Dease, Beachy, they all have islands named after them, and you will hear a lot of these names throughout my presentation in reference to the islands. And in 1851, Sir Robert McClure actually did find the passage, but it was packed in with ice and unsaleable, which has been the case ever since, pretty much. So this is an incredibly important expedition. The Royal Navy put a huge effort in and spared no expense in outfitting this expedition. They, of course, wanted to find the very best person to lead the expedition. That was William Perry, and he said no. So their second was James Clark Ross, again, the Antarctic explorer who had been to the Arctic as well. Unfortunately, his last trip to the Antarctic was rather traumatic, and he decided he didn't ever want to go anywhere cold again. James Fitzjames was considered. He actually was on the expedition. He was a highly decorated navalman. Unfortunately, he was seen to be too young and too inexperienced to lead an expedition of this magnitude and this dangerous, frankly. George Back was too argumentative. Francis Crozier, again, this is Francis Crozier was on the expedition, was passed over for the choice of commander, sadly, because he had the most experience, not just doing Arctic exploration, but exploration in this area of the Arctic. Unfortunately, he was an Irishman of humble birth, and that would never do for the Royal Navy, so he wasn't chosen either. So Sir John Franklin was the sixth choice to lead this oh so important expedition, and he accepted, as we know. So who is Sir John Franklin? Well, he was an explorer. He was a career Navy. He was of noble birth. He had a really good war record and had done a lot of exploration. He was also in politics. And unfortunately, his last post, which was as governor of Van Diemen's Land, which is Tasmania now, ended in great disgrace for him. He was actually fired and removed from that post. And so they sort of gave him this expedition to kind of throw him a bone and show that he still had things to contribute. He had done several attempts at the Arctic exploration. This was actually his third attempt to find the Northwest Passage. The first two were overland. In 1819 to 22, he, this map cut off, so I couldn't see where he started from, but they came down into Hudson's Bay and went overland to what is now Saskatchewan and came up to the coastline at Victoria Strait. They couldn't get anywhere further than that, the way that they had been provisioned, and so they turned around and went home with having mapped a good chunk of the coastline. In 1825 to 27, he tried again and went further west overland this time and mapped another good chunk of the Arctic coast. Unfortunately, a lot of tragedy hit this expedition. They a lot of people died. Only half of the entourage made it back, and those that did make it back came back with stories of how they literally had to boil and eat their boots to survive, which I'm sure in the Canadian Arctic was oh so much fun.
Hey.
Someone have a question? So this was his first attempt doing a sea route, and they have tracked his progress from meeting up with other fishermen. They set out, of course, in the springtime, and whale season was getting going. So these waters here had a lot of whaling activity. And there were several accounts from other ships where they bumped into Franklin, exchanged Franklin's crew exchanged mail. Actually, on one of the first intersections of crews that they had, Franklin sent one fellow back to England. He had gotten very ill and knew he wouldn't survive trying to get through the worst of the expedition. So they sent him home with one of the whaling ships. Here at Devon Island, they actually spent some time with another whaling crew here. And this was the last known contact. And if any of you, I don't know if any of you have watched The Terror or read the book called The Terror, but all of this has been really well documented in there. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it, even though it is fiction from this point on, but it is a look into what might have happened. And so there's some pretty good documentation about with interviews from the captain of the whaling expedition. So that summer they went up around Beachy Island, and they ended up wintering in over here. And then they started coming south the following spring. And this is where things really start to take a turn for the worst. And we know about the approximate routes that they took from message cairns that they left along the way for other people to find. So let's talk a bit about the ships involved. The Erebus and the Terror were the two ships. The Erebus is a Hecla-class bombing vessel, and the Terror was a Vesuvius-class bombing vessels. These two ships in particular were chosen because the bomb vessels had already been designed to withstand being bombed. And so they had sturdier hulls and some reinforced bracing. So they started with these enhanced ships and kind of made them into a Frankenstein. These the ships ended up being still mostly sailing ships, but that was also the very first ships, I believe, in the world that also had a steam-powered engine and a propeller. And so they also needed coal. And you can see in the lower hold here was devoted to coal storage. Other modifications they made was to completely encase the bow and the stern of the ship in 5 feet thick of iron cladding so that the ships could break through the ice. The purpose behind the coal engines in the ship wasn't so much to help with the sail. I mean, they couldn't carry even close to enough coal with them to do that. They reserved for this effort for when they got stuck in the pack ice so that they could actually break their way through. And so it was the prop was here at the at the stern of the boat, of course, along with the rudder, and both the prop and the rudder were redesigned so that they could actually retract into the hold of the ship to make sure, and when they had to overwinter in the ice, that they didn't get damaged. The decks on all levels had extensive cross bracing, apologies, so that they could withstand pressure from ice on all sides of the hull. This was also the first naval vessel that had a water boiler on board, which you can see here sort of near the middle of the ship. Not only did the water boiler provide heat, which obviously would be essential in an Arctic voyage, but it also helped them distill water. So they had plenty of fresh water to drink. So I don't think these are going to show up very well on most people's screens, but these are some of the architectural drawings of the modifications they did to the ship. You can see how thick the iron cladding is around this is the stern of the ship here on the right. So the last known contact was with the whaling ship I'd already mentioned, but this here is the last communication that they found. This was a navigational cairn that was established in an earlier expedition through this area. And whenever on an exploring mission, the Navy always sends these pre-printed notes to leave behind with the date. And I think I can zoom in here. And you can see this is the HMS Erebus and the Terror, wintered in the ice, May 1847, the latitude and longitude. And here it says they wintered at Beechey Island, and now they're trying other routes. How do I get out of that? There we are. So this was first left in 1847, the 25th of May. And it said it was signed by Franklin, and it was signed by his second in command on his ship, which was James Fitzjames. And it said all is well. And then at a later date, and I haven't been able to make out the writing, but what's on the side, both sides and written upside down at the top is a later update. And it says, I said that was 47. I'm sorry, I misread that. That's actually 1845.
No, it says 1844.
And so they wintered on Beechey Island. In September of 46, it says, this is the notes added later, that both ships became trapped in the ice. And from this point, the ships never sailed again. Franklin died here on the 11th of June in 1847, and it should be noted that his grave has actually never been found. This depression that you see in the center photograph, they haven't really figured out what that was. Probably a tent, but whatever it was, they took everything with them when they left. So you can see the cairn on the right and these copper tubes. These are what the British Navy left their communications in. So a bit of an orientation. King William Island is where they ended up. I'm going to zoom in as much as I can here, where they eventually ended up. And these, what's noted on the map here, I hope you can read it, are remains from the expedition that archaeologists and other explorers have found over the years. So the ships got trapped in the ice substantially north of here and then once that happens in the pack ice in the Arctic, it's not stable. The ice pack still flows and the boats have no choice, but they flow with it. And so they've recreated that. I'm trying to get that to go away, is that the drift, the boats in the ice pack drifted around the western coast of King William Island. And you can see here, this is the latitude and longitude given for where they decided they eventually had to abandon the ships and start heading overland to find rescue. So that was documented by Crozier. I had mentioned that John Franklin was the admiral of the whole expedition. James Fitzjames, the one that was too young to lead, was actually the captain of the Erebus, and Crozier was the captain of the Terror. So it was those three in line. And when they updated the Cairn message the second time, it was signed by Crozier and another officer, not Fitzjames. So it's unclear as to whether or not he was still alive at this point. But they decided to come and walk across or along the coast of King William Island. It was much easier than going across the pack ice, and go to Backfish River, which is south of here in the Adelaide Peninsula. So they wanted to find here the tracks of the men. They actually, 4 men did make it this far south. But they never made it past here, past this region. What's really difficult to understand is I have another map later on that I'll explain, but from where the Erebus and the Terror were abandoned up here to the north of King William Island, about 250 kilometers north and east was, or actually it was Maddie Island here, the wrecked ship. On the right side of the screen, I keep forgetting you guys can't see my my cursor here, but Maddie Island on the right side of the screen, there had been a previous shipwreck here in shallow water, and the crew survived. They were saved by whalers because this is a very heavily trafficked whaling area. And all of the supplies that were on this wrecked ship were dragged and brought onto the island and stored there for emergencies as a cache if people needed it. So Crozier could have brought his men across King William Island over to Maddie Island to finish out the winter where there were food supplies. But for some reason, instead, he thought it was a better bet to bring them all the way south. This is almost 1,200 kilometers to get to the closest Hudson's Bay Company fur trade post. And that was their intended destination. So this is really the first clue that something was seriously wrong with the expedition and possibly with the crew itself. So let's talk a bit about what the winter is like in the Canadian Arctic. In the beginning of the winter, the ice can be fairly flat. It actually, it gets covered with snow, and it's fairly easy to traverse. But as the winds pick up and the ice flows start moving, they crash together, pieces break apart, and you end up with jumble ice like this. Their overland travel route was via a sledge, which is this hand drawing in the upper right corner. This is essentially one of the lifeboats from the vessels, and it had been fitted with sled skis on it to help it go over the ice. This is how they intended, if they had to leave the ship and do some overland trekking, they could load up supplies into the boat and drag it with them across the ice. Empty, these sledges weighed over 1,400 pounds. So can you imagine trying to drag 1,400 pounds of dead weight, plus all the provisions inside it, over this jumble ice? This is not an easy feat at all. One of the sledges was found, and it still had a lot of its contents in it. It had been flipped over, and anything that was inside it had actually been pretty well preserved. And what they found and what they took with them to evacuate their boats to survive the next few months as they trekked over land was numerous pairs of boots, very practical, sponges, soap, silk handkerchiefs. We're still in the realm of very functional things here. Over 25 pounds of chocolate, slippers, hair combs, bolts of cloth, and books, many, many books. I think they estimated over 1,000 pounds of books, including a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield, by Oliver Goldsmith. So what they were escaping with was not essentials. And actually, there were also several sets of curtain rods from the officers' quarters. This doesn't really sound like decisions being made from people with sound minds, in my opinion. But I should also note that they did have quite a bit of canned foods. This was also the very first expedition to be outfitted with canned foods in any ship in the world. It was very expensive. The Navy had a contract with one canner in particular, and they only gave them 2 weeks to make and seal and properly preserve enough provisions for 150 men to last 3 years. The expedition was supposed to last a year and a half, and they wanted to make sure that they had extra in case they had to winter, an extra winter in the ice pack. And one of the other wonderful traits of the Arctic when you get ice rafting, which causes all of this ice breakage, is it can create large hills. And in fact, the Terror had been stuck in the ice in the Arctic on a previous expedition where the ice rafting for the whole of the winter held the boat 30 feet off of the surface, off of the ice on a hill. And the people had there was nothing they could do to get it down other than hope that everything melted slowly and evenly and the boat didn't tip over in the springtime. So this is some pretty extreme environment that they're dealing with. So by the end of the second year, it was supposed to be 18-month journey. By the end of the second year, Mrs. Franklin is very concerned. She appeals to the Navy that they need to start sending rescue missions. No one has heard from them since that last whaling ship where everything was perfectly fine. So the Navy decides to offer a reward and to outfit people to other explorers to go out. And of course, their main intent was to find the Franklin expedition and bring them home. But, if you happen to, map some new areas of the coastline and maybe find the Northwest Passage, that'd be great too. So the Navy, of course, has ulterior motives, and many people tried. Over 50 expeditions were sent over the next 20 years to try and find the Franklin expedition. The first half of them were paid for by the Navy, and then when the Navy started saying no to Mrs. Franklin, she went directly to the Crown and got the King to pony up for rescue missions. She had fundraisers. She was quite possibly the most dedicated naval wife in the history of the Navy. And ironically, this is kind of color coded here. These are the different expeditions, some of the first expeditions that went in search, starting at the end of 1848. Each color is a separate expedition. You can see that the search for Franklin actually resulted in mapping more of the coastline of the Canadian Arctic that Franklin ever did. So the Crown did ultimately get their map of the Arctic, and in these other subsequent expeditions concluded that there just isn't a navigable Northwest Passage. There is plenty of water there, but it never de-ices enough to make for safe passage. So there were, of course, plenty of rumors from the local Inuit community. Some of the first explorers to try and find the Franklin expedition would go and speak to local Inuit people and ask about them. And there were all kinds of stories and artifacts, including these are sunglasses. Basically, it's to prevent against windburn and snow blindness, which if you have ever had the misfortune of having snow blindness, it's one of the most excruciating things. So they found actually several pairs of these in the hands of the Inuit. And also other trinkets like brass buttons that were definitely Navy issue, and some wool that had been repurposed, that obviously were clothes and had been repurposed into different types of clothing and coverings for the Inuit. Anything that they found that they could repurpose, they did. So these were some of the first clues on how far inland they had gotten. So with the native legends and the artifacts and some of the remains that were starting to be found in the summertime, people started piecing together the story. So here, starting at the bottom, the Terror, Erebus and the Terror left London in May 1845. I'm sorry, I misspoke. They had enough food and supplies to last for 7 years. In 45, in July, they encountered 2 ships heading for Lancaster Sound. In number 3 here, a note was found by one of the missions that shows crews camped on Beachy Island. This was left in the cairn before heading south to Victoria Strait. And this map is kind of on a kilter from everything else I've shown you. Apologize for that. This is showing where the ships became trapped in the ice between Beechy Island and King William Island. And then in 2014, the wreckage of the HMS Erebus was discovered in southern Victoria Strait. And then the Terror was found in September of 2016 on the ocean floor. So I would hate to actually try and tally up how many millions and millions of dollars have been spent trying to figure out what happened to Franklin and his crew. But ultimately, at the turn of the 20th century, Roald Amundsen, which is another explorer, did manage to sail the passage in an incredibly warm summer, was able to make it all the way across. But after he did this, he was very clear that there was no way that this was a reliable route. So the government of Canada, I mentioned, the Erebus was found in 2014. This was Parks Canada, an effort, a huge effort actually, to not only do ethnographic documentation of the Inuit, including the oral legends of these white men who had gotten lost and were wandering aimlessly around the Arctic. They put together some expeditions with the Inuit, who were able to take them to some grave sites, ranging from full-on interments to bones just scattered on the surface of the ground. And again, on this map here, you see this is where the ships were abandoned. The first graves were found on Beechy Island, which is, it says Devon Island. Beechy Island is a tiny island just off the coast of Devon, between Devon Island and Cornwallis Island. There were other remains on Cornwallis Island, and Prince of Wales Island. They were doing day trips or week-long trips away from the ships as the ships drifted to try and find open water or anything that they could to try and break free and figure out where their next best path was. So the Erebus and the Terror were eventually found on the seafloor here by Parks Canada using side scan sonar. And then through surveys that they did along King William Island, they found the clear boxes here are all human remains, scattered human remains, but then the filled in boxes are where numerous people had been left. And then they ended up at Starvation Cove. What a wonderful name. And it looks indeed like that is what happened there. And this was the southernmost trace of human remains that have been found to date. So we've seen this. And again, why head south? This is King William Island, and they were here when they abandoned the ships. They were trying to get to south of, it's off the map, but south of the Arctic Circle, around the edge of Hudson's Bay, to meet up with the closest Hudson Bay fur trade fort. Where again, if they had just walked across King William Island and across a few miles of the ice, they would have gotten to Matty Island, where there was a large cache of food. So from here on, we are going to be showing plenty of pictures of human remains. If you're sensitive, I warn you, not all of them are skeletal. The graves that had been dug into the permafrost preserved 4 bodies very well. They were essentially mummified. They weren't quite mummified, actually, but they just hadn't, they were leathery and dried out, but not completely on the inside, and well enough preserved that when the graves were found in the 80s, an expedition from the University of Alberta actually disinterred them with permission, of course, from the Crown and also from the descendants' families to perform autopsies on them and find out why they died. There are several piles of bones, piles of skulls, just laying on the surface, and other long bones scattered about by probably polar bears and Arctic foxes and whatever else. And some just lightly in the ground, which is a bit perplexing to me, actually. Why would they be partially buried when nothing else is? They didn't dig a grave. One of the Inuit tales of the Europeans is that they had resorted to cannibalism. And of course, the Royal Navy swept that under the rug as quickly as possible. And of course, the explorer that was told this was completely discredited and stripped of all of his titles and honors at the very thought that he was suggesting the Royal Navy expedition had eaten their comrades to stay alive. But when we started finding bone, there are a lot of cut marks on the bones, and a lot of the skulls have big chunks missing in the back to extract the brain. And I'll discuss why that is significant in a couple of slides. So these are the 4 graves that were found on Beechey Island. You can see from an aerial view, and they're covered in, I believe they're covered in snow, a light skiff of snow. And then graves, they have, somewhat crude, but still very identifiable headstones. And the remains of an encampment here. You can see all of these tins that were left in the sign of a cross. Another note about the tin food: as the expedition wore on, they started realizing that the tins, a lot of them hadn't properly sealed, and more than half of the tins of the food was rotted and had botulism. So that was one of the theories of what started to go wrong, was they were sick from food poisoning. One of the very many theories that have been proposed. So in 1984 and 1986, Owen Beatty at the University of Alberta decided he was going to bring a crew up and excavate, disinter these gentlemen and do an autopsy on them. And if you look at the timeline of the expedition, the earliest graves were on Beechey Island. They were formal interments. They were dug. Franklin had made his crew members dig 1.5 meters deep in permafrost to bury these 4 poor souls, to give them a proper Christian burial, as it were. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. I ended up, early in my career, I worked with a member of Dr. Beatty's 84 to 86 expedition. And he said just trying to re-excavate them was bad enough. He couldn't imagine being the first one to try to sink those holes in the ground in the first place. And that's why the bodies were so well preserved. They were in actual wooden caskets. They were fully clothed, buried with honors, even some personal trinkets. But as you start heading further south, the sailors that died after abandoning the ships, they were just kind of either left where they died, or they were all piled up, as you saw in the previous slide, with the piles of skulls you see. There were several areas like that that had numerous people. And interestingly enough, in their DNA studies, they found that 4 of Franklin's men were actually women, which is very interesting. They found this through DNA testing, so it's about as sure as we can be. They've been able to collect DNA samples from 24 of the individuals whose bones have been recovered. So one of the leading theories that they came to after this expedition was that maybe the crew had gone crazy from lead poisoning. These are the cans, and you can see the top right photo, some bulges here. This is lead soldering. And the inside of a lot of these cans had copious amounts of lead soldering. And what was in these tins were acidic foods. They were tomato-based soups and stews. And so it was thought that the acids from the food actually leached a lot of the lead out from the solder, and maybe people had mental defects from ingesting so much lead. This has become an incredible debate that has been going on since the 80s. One of the studies associated with Beatty's expedition was actually an old boss of mine. It was his PhD thesis. And he was looking into the lead theory, and to this day is firmly convinced that it was lead poisoning that ended up in their ultimate demise. They did some testing for heavy metals in the bones, and from the autopsy from 3 of the fellows that they examined in the soft tissue, and found that they had 300 times the amount of lead that is considered safe by our standards today. There's some problems with this theory, but I'll get into that in a little bit. And just as a warning, the next photo is of our 3 autopsy individuals. So the bottom left, is John Torrington. The right is William Brain, and the top left is John Hartnell. So these were the men that were dug up and subjected to a full medical autopsy, why incisions and everything. Interestingly enough, one of the members of this trip, I had mentioned that that Dr. Beatty had made sure to get permission from the descendant families of these men. We had their names from their grave markers. And one of the fellows that joined them on this expedition to do the autopsies was a descendant of, I think it was John Hartnell. So we got a bit of a familial connection here, which must have been a really interesting experience for them. So, and you can see the black on the foreheads of Torrington and Hartnell. That's frostbite. So they were obviously really quite miserable when they died. interestingly enough, all of their intestines were completely empty. They hadn't eaten in days. And yet starvation was not ruled as the cause of death. The cause of death was not overly apparent. One of them had signs of scurvy, definitely an advanced case of scurvy, which is pretty common in any sailors at this time. Another one had, actually William Brain on the right here had tuberculosis of the spine, but they can't say whether or not that's what killed him. And Hartnell here at the top had also tuberculosis, mild tuberculosis, but also had pneumonia. So it's possible that he died from pneumonia and wasn't lead or anything, but all three of these fellows had very high lead concentrations in both their soft tissue and in their bones. Another aspect of the lead poisoning scenario is, if you recall me mentioning that the ships had water boilers on board, those were lead pipes. And that was their fresh water that they were drinking every single day. So, and cooking with as well. So there was another avenue for lead exposure. And it was thought too that the lower ranks of the crews would have been more exposed to lead because they would have taken the cooler water that was already settling in the pipes so they'd been sitting in the pipes for a while and potentially had leached more of the lead out than after you've been running the water for a little while. This is actually one of the reasons why a lot of researchers are disregarding the lead poisoning theory, because the lead concentrations are highly variable. It's not restricted to rank. The lower the rank, the higher the lead content does not follow, which is what you would expect to see if that were the case. So we know they were starving. All three of those fellows were incredibly emaciated. I think one of them weighed 70 pounds. And what they found when they started finding the skeletal remains out on the surface that had been scattered around is a lot of cut marks. And you can see on the skeleton on the right, these cut marks are in areas where it's easiest to remove large muscle groups. This is what we refer to as beginning stage cannibalism, where they're cherry picking the areas that are easy to get to. They're probably really not happy at all that they're having to do this to their crewmates, but it's that or starve to death. So they're trying to do this delicately and respectfully. And that changes as we move further south as well. Also, where we find large piles of bone, we also find scatters of much smaller pieces of bone. And these pieces have what we refer to as pot polish on them. This is polished areas on the bone that are created from the bone swirling around in a pot of boiling water and rubbing against the sides of the vessel. So a lot of the smaller fragments had obviously been boiled. I mentioned that some of the craniums were missing big chunks from the back, which is a sign that they were extracting the brain. So we have signs right from beginning stage cannibalism where they're just taking the really fleshy bits to getting really desperate enough that they are actually pulverizing the bone and boiling it to get the marrow out and eating brains. So this was going on for quite a while. And remember, John Ray was the first one in 1854 to come back and report that it appeared that they had resorted to cannibalism. And he was laughed at. He was made a laughing stock and died in disgrace years later. But now we know without a doubt that they obviously had resorted to cannibalism in all of its degrees. Now, the Inuit community, of course, any human community, frankly, that lives in a harsh environment isn't going to look down on gifts, I suppose you would call it, that was left for them. This is actually an ulu made from the lid of one of the cans of food, with a bone handle and a bone haft. And this was what John Ray was starting to find when he went up and started interviewing the Inuit communities, was these traces that, not indicative of trade with the Franklin expedition or Europeans in general, but scavenging what they're finding on the ground and making use of it. So let's get on to how they found the ships. Parks Canada started doing some underwater sonar scanning of the area, and lo and behold, one rather frigid summer day, found what turned out to be the hull of the Erebus. These are 3D renderings of what the ship looked like. This is in the early 90s. And you can see the timbers that have come off and are just laying here around the side. So this was the Erebus. They found, I believe it was a bell. And look at how well, I'm really astounded at how well preserved most of it is, due to the cold water, of course. But Parks Canada spent a long time doing all kinds of mapping and documenting, and eventually found the bell, which is how they determined that it was the Erebus. That was in, they started looking for it in the 90s. It wasn't found until 2014. I think actually the year before this, when they started to find signatures that there could be something there, but they were at the end of the field season and couldn't extend their field season long enough to do more. So they marked the spot and went back the next summer. Unfortunately, in between, it was just after 2014, Prime Minister Stephen Harper slashed the budget of Parks Canada. They were able to go back out in 2016, and that's when they found the terror. And of course, he had huge press conferences and all kinds of patting himself on the back, when everyone else at Parks Canada was gritting their teeth because it almost didn't happen because they didn't have the budget for it. But so in 2016 they went back to find the terror, and these are the side scan and some underwater photography of the remains. There's a nice shark there. They found the wheel. And that's it. This was the last piece that they were looking for, was the ships. They've never found Franklin's grave. We knew that he passed away in the middle of the expedition. They didn't say why. But you have to wonder why it's such a, sorry, I'm tripping over my words tonight, but a mystery and such a heated debate on why they died. A lot of the researchers, the lead poisoning debate has been going back and forth in the scientific literature literally since the 80s, from Walt Kowal proposing it was lead poisoning to him being called down by another researcher 10 years later who said, no, everyone in the Navy at that time had those levels of lead. Well, then they did a study and found that no, they didn't have such high levels of lead, although they did in certain individual circumstances, it wasn't the norm. But when you think about Crozier's decision to make his crew walk over 1,400 kilometers south to Backsfish River versus 250 kilometers due west to an area where there was food, a known food supply, that doesn't sound like the decision of someone with a sound mind to me. And then also considering some of the things that they put into their sledges to drag over the jumble ice. It really is perplexing that, why would they bring curtain rods? Why would they bring books? I mean, maybe they would use them as tinder for fire, but they didn't find any remains of burned books. And there was over 1,000 pounds of them still in the sledge when they found it. So I am really firmly of the opinion
Are we still all out there?
I'm here.
I'm
I'm
here.
here. Me too.
I think we lost her.
Froze up on mine.
I don't know if I cut out there.
You
Oh,
did.
you cut out and you're back.
How long was I cut out for?
Oh, minute or so.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just pondering about whether or not they were truly of sound mind. But as it is, we have solved a lot of the mysteries, although haven't found a smoking gun of what ultimately killed them. I don't think it was one thing, but I do think that they were definitely struggling with mental faculties. Be that as it may, the quest for the Northwest Passage is quickly becoming a major concern again with climate change and the lessening ice pack in the Canadian Arctic. And there have been several attempts now by the US, by Canada, by Russia, probably other entities that I'm not aware of, where they're trying to lay claim to parts of the continental shelf so that they could say that these waters belong to Alaska or Russia or Canada, because they want to be able to have a foothold if it becomes habitually safely passable. And adventurers are still have the drive to go and make this same trip from the eastern seaboard of Canada to the western tip of Alaska. This was, I don't have the year on here, but this is from I think it was from 2002. Women Wanted, hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete sunlight, constant danger. This group, Susan Eaton, she has a big website. She wanted to be the first people to actually scuba dive the Northwest Passage. I haven't been able to find out if they were ever able to make this journey, and actually if she got any volunteers. And that concludes my presentation.
Well, do we have any questions? Well, I have a question. So you can scuba dive today on these wrecks? They let you do that?
If you can find it,
Oh, well, the coordinates aren't GPSed in? I would
well,
think, but
it's
they probably just don't want to pass them out.
yeah, it's much like the US, the locations of archaeological sites are protected in Canada as well. So yeah, Parks Canada is not too keen on let's make that bigger so I can see who I'm talking to here. Is not too keen on letting a lot of people know where it is because they know that people are going to go and bring home trinkets and basically loot the site. And the more people we introduce into that biome, the more chance there is for damage to the ships, what's left of them. So yeah, Parks Canada is keeping the exact location pretty tightly under wraps.
Hello, this
Go
is
ahead, Chris.
I have a question. Early on, I thought you mentioned that as they came south, did you say that 4 of them survived and made it to the camp of the Hudson Bay Company? Or
No,
did I hear that? Okay,
nobody survived.
okay.
The number 4 was mentioned because stop, because 4 of the sets of human remains that they were able to do DNA testing turned out to be women.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Sandra, did you
They-
see that mysterious something that came behind you?
Yes, that was my mysterious oldest son. He loves to prank people.
That's pretty funny.
Any other
So
questions?
so you can scuba dive on these if you can find them. How deep
Yeah.
are they?
I don't know.
Okay.
I can tell you that the water is incredibly clear there.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure you can scuba dive in very cold water. Obviously, I'm not an expert at all. Jerome might be. I think he taught scuba diving for a while.
Hmm. I believe they did use a lot of drone photography, submersible photography.
Okay. Well, that's fascinating. So what's the plan for the ships? Just like a lot of archaeological sites, just keep them hidden so people can't find them and leave them alone?
Yep. I mean, the second they try to move them, they'll fall apart. So it's best to let them stay there. I think if anyone is going to put as much effort in research and money into an expedition to go out there and find it to go and scuba dive around it, they're probably going to respect what they have, what they're able to see down there, and hopefully not damage it or take anything, because it is no small feat to get up to that area. It's very expensive.
Well, guys and gals, you have any other questions? Don't be
So
bashful.
was it the pressure of the ice that sank the ships eventually? They were-
Ultimately, that's what they think. Yes. When the pack ice moves, but it doesn't move as one. It's like big plates kind of going past each other. And if you're a tiny little ship and you're stuck between what's basically a scaled down two tectonic plates trying to get past each other, you're not going to survive. And a lot of ships in Arctic and Antarctic exploration have been lost in that way. It perforates holes in the hull and they sink as soon as spring starts to thaw the ice.
Anybody have any ideas why or how the crews of the ship lived as long as they did? Because you would think they would freeze to death first.
Yep, you would think. So long as they were near their ships and near the major camps that they had established, they had tents, they had canvas, they had things to make fire with from wood from the ships. That becomes dicier the further you go away. But as you start losing colleagues, they're going to take those extra set of boots and the extra coat and, repurpose it, try to keep whoever is remaining alive. So they're scavenging from their crewmates, not just their meat, but they're scavenging their belongings as well.
Jerome, do you have a question? Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna comment on the Terror. I'm familiar with that ship, and it was used during the American Revolution by the British in the Battle of Stonington, Connecticut. Those were called bomb ships.
Yep.
And they were built extremely heavy because instead of a regular naval cannon carriage, they used what was similar to a mortar, which was mounted on the top of the decks of these bomb ships, and they were like huge kettles that would fire a giant bomb. Basically, that's why they were called bomb ships. So the decks had to be extremely sturdy to support that kind of energy being pushed downward onto the ship from a cannon mounted on the deck. So that's why they used that kind of ship for Arctic exploration, because they were built so heavily.
Mm-hmm.
Correct?
In
And-
fact, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that's about all I had to say. Thank you.
The Terror was in the Arctic before with the HMS Resolute. And the Resolute got iced in. It had to be abandoned. And this was, I don't remember what year this was, actually. And the Terror, all of the crew got on the Terror and they went back to England and had to abandon the ship. Well, the next summer, an American, I think it was a whaling expedition, found the ship perfectly intact and was floating, maybe not all perfect, but still seaworthy, and actually took it upon themselves to tow it back to England for them. And the ship was decommissioned, and as a token of thanks, I think the American government had actually paid for the ship to be brought back to England. And as a thank you to the American government, 2 desks were made with the wood from the HMS Resolute. One of them is in Buckingham Palace to this day, and its mate, an exact copy of it. Does anyone know where it is?
White House.
It's in the Oval Office in the White House. That's the president's desk.
Oh, really?
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was a gift from the Queen or the King to the American government as a thank you. So
Amazing.
there's your a nice American tie in there to an otherwise English and Canadian story.
And according to the movie National Treasure, it has a secret compartment, doesn't it?
I believe it has several, actually. But that is, as far as I've been able to tell, that is actually true.
I think
Well-
that's fiction though, but go ahead.
Any
So if
other
AMC
question?
actually did a TV series on the Terror, the book, and as I said, the book is fiction. It has a lot of great research on Franklin and other notable men in the crew, impeccably researched. But the bulk of the book picks up after their last contact with the whalers. And so it's pure speculation, using, you know, what little evidence that they had in the 80s. I believe it was written in the late 80s. And also intermingling it with Inuit lore, so to try and put together a story of what may have happened. So it's definitely a bit otherworldly, but it is a fabulous book. I read it. I've read it many times. And the TV series actually was pretty good too. So if you have AMC or if you have Apple TV, you can buy it, and watch it, and it's pretty good.
Any more questions, guys and gals?
No questions from my crew. Guess not.
Well, if there's no questions, thank you very much for the presentation. It was
Oh,
wonderful.
thank you. It was great.
And we all need to clap, but you probably won't hear it, so we'll do something like it, you know.
Thank you.
If you send me your mailing address, we'll send you something in the mail in return.
Thank you.
But I thought it was very, very well done. So with
Yeah.
that said,
Very interesting. Yeah, thank you very much.
Very interesting. Yeah.
so with that said, we're going to bring our meeting to a close. And everybody, thanks for coming. We had a wonderful turnout as usual. And don't forget field school's coming up, which hopefully everybody can attend. That'll be a lot of exciting and different kinds of things we're going to go find on that mission, I hope.
Yeah, for a whole week.
A whole week. All right. See y'all later. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you.